Hey everybody, it's Tom Lynn, and I'm here this week. We're going to talk about an essay of Jean Paul Sartre, Existentialism. I believe it's found in several different collections, but the collection in particular from which I'm drawing is this: Existentialism and Human Emotions. Existentialism and Human Emotions, which, let me double check, I think this was originally published in 1957. So, oldie but goldie. This is a nice little collection altogether. Most of it is drawn from Sartre's Being and Nothing, or Being and Nothingness. But this essay was originally part of a different volume and has some interest for us because it does exactly the kind of thing we want to do. It takes a word, which is often thrown around, and it really sort of says, now, what are we really talking about? The word in question is existentialism. What is existentialism? A lot of times, at least in the American discourse, when people think of philosophy, the word existentialism often sort of follows in its wake in how it lives in our consciousness. Like, oh, the existentialists, they're just these beat poets dressed in black in coffee shops talking about politics and art that no one understands. These are all relatively superficial impressions of the word, and it's a superficiality which Sartre was seeking, as he explicitly states in the opening, to dispel, along with certain criticisms of existentialism, that it was pessimistic, that it was solipsistic, things to that effect. And after declaring that, he grounds his definition by asking, what do you mean by existence versus essence? Because existentialism wants to say that existence is what is primary. But what do we mean by that? Well, what do we mean by essence? And he uses the example of a paper cutter, but you can take any artifact, anything, like this pen, for example. What is it that makes this pen, its function, the manner in which it is produced within a certain context of late capitalism and so forth? It's connected with writing and that form of expression, all that. But at the end of the day, all these things which contribute to what makes the pen what it is, what it makes the pen what it is essentially, are sort of imposed upon the pen. The pen doesn't have any choice in the matter as to what it is, okay? And in a way, we are making it what it is because we are rendering it in a fashion which is significant for our culture. But in a universe without human beings, what is this? This is just an aggregate of matter. Even that's kind of a provocative statement when you start thinking about it, because what does that even mean to have a universe without human beings? And we can come back to that question momentarily after I note that, having clarified what essence is, he says, well, what's unique? And he uses the word man, but he's the humanity, the human being. What's unique about us is that we make our own essence. And that process of self-determination, that is existing. Okay, to exist is to determine who and what we are as we are who and what we are. That we're thrown into the world, which is a phrase which kind of originates with Heidegger. We're just sort of, oh, here we are, okay? But when we arrive on the scene, we don't have a fixed or determined identity, a fixed or determined nature, all right? And that is what is really astonishing about the human situation. But we have no choice but the choice to, in the wake of that indeterminacy, actually select, form an identity. Now, we don't elect, select, or form that identity by just doing this action or that action. All our various actions as individual sort of gestures grow out of a more primary image of who and what we are. The action expresses a sense of identity. And now here's the crazy part. The crazy part is that when we make that selection, and this is sort of what is characteristic of sort of not only Sartre's existentialism, but this sort of particular line or trajectory of existentialism. We are not just making that decision for ourselves as individuals. We're making that decision for everyone because of a universal ground which connects us. What is that universal ground? That universal ground is the situation of subjectivity. What is that situation? It's what I just outlined in part a few moments ago when I was saying how, we're thrown to the world, we don't have an essence, so we have to form the essence. All right? Now, the other side of that equation is that, and realizing that to be our scenario, and realizing that is our I-ness, and he uses the concept of the cogito, as Descartes discusses it, I think, therefore I am, is a way into this realization. And you can probably quibble a little bit with how he is using Descartes there, but that's not really what we're trying to accomplish in this conversation. We can come back to that. I'm just trying to spell out the major points he articulates in the essay. Using that as a way into this realization, he says, look, we realize not just our I-ness and the need to form our identity, we also realize that our I-ness is intimately connected with the other, that is, other people, other human beings, other beings that share this situation of subjectivity. And so what we have is a call to two things: radical lucidity and radical responsibility. We have to become utterly transparent with respect to life, what's happening right now. And that transparency will elicit an insight into this radical responsibility. Hear the jangling of Immanuel Kant in the background here. Immanuel Kant, famous smasher of everything. Kant uses the word maxim, but you can ask, whether your action can be translated into universal maxim is a Kantian phrase. The way Sartre puts it is, ask yourself the situation, if everyone behaved as I behaved, what would happen? And when you really, let that question sit, you realize just how much, responsibility lies on your shoulders. Because you realize the profound moral repercussions of acting in a way which would produce an unsettling answer to that question. Like, what if everybody lied? That's a rather disconcerting situation, okay? And so on with other kinds of acts in that respect. What you have is actually kind of an interesting transformation of one reading of Kant's morality, which is like a morality of moral responsibility based on established a priori principles. A priori meaning that which is established before anything else happens, okay? Well, Sartre says, hey, check it out. There are no a priori principles. Be nice if there were, but there aren't. However, we are in a situation where we must act as if there are a priori principles because we are the creators of our identity for both ourselves and for others through the assertion of value. What constitutes the assertion of value? Action. When we act, we affirm a vision of the world. And when we're doing that lucidly and with the cognizance of the radical responsibility which attends that, we are also drawn to certain, rather, at least initially, unsettling experiences. And in the essay, Sartre talks about three of these. He talks about anguish, forlornness, and despair. Anguish in that we realize that in any given situation, We've got A, B, C, and D. We've got really an infinite number of choices before us, but we can only elect one. And we're not in a position to elect that one optimally with a safety net. And as a result, we could, in fact, by our choices, create a situation of suffering for others. He uses the analogy of a military leader just by way of illustration, where it's like, okay, you have command over so many troops and you have to send some of them into battle. You have to make a decision how you're going to do that. And he could set them this way or he could set them that way. But at the end of the day, he can only send them one way. And it could be that that way leads to devastating casualties. But appreciating that situation does not remove the responsibility for action. If there's anything fixed in Sartre's account, is that we have to act, that we have to choose. Even not to choose is to choose. And thus, the implacability of this anguish, perhaps. One way people can try to mollify that anguish is to say that there is something extrinsic to the human condition which can sort of balance the equation. Something like a god or something to that effect. And we can sort of relay our responsibility ultimately to that god and thus avoid this. Now, some important qualifications here. People use the notion of God in that sense, but that's not the only way in which to use God. And I would argue that, in fact, it's a misuse of the concept. And this can be done not just with God, but it can be done with other ideological frameworks as well. The notion of a secular ethics, where certain things are just innate to nature. An attempt to naturalize our moral frameworks as expressions of biology. It's actually the same move. You are evading your responsibility. You are not being honest. Similarly, we're drawn to forlornness, a kind of melancholy, because in the background of what we've discussed is basically an appreciation that we're on our own. There is no God, effectively. Even if there's a God, there's no God, because man is free, and that freedom is what is creating this situation. And that's all well and good, but and you see, this part I think is like implicit. He doesn't say this implicitly, but I think what really creates a kind of forlornness or melancholy there isn't simply that we realize our radical responsibility. We realize our radical responsibility and that our own capacity to meet the challenges of our circumstances is finite, fallible, imperfect. And there is no way out of that wicket. And what's then saddening, or what creates the forlornness, is the fact that other people can potentially suffer in virtue of our choices and our finitude. That's what creates the forlornness, but you see right on the heels of that is also the realization of a kind of despair. And despair is precisely the sense of our own finitude. The fact that we have to reckon with probabilities, I believe, is actually the phrase that Sartre uses in the essay. And the fact that there are things outside of our control. So to come back then to the root of the essay, existentialism. What is existentialism? Existentialism is the position that we can encounter and face the challenges of our circumstances and the emotionalities that arise from those circumstances in a meaningful way. And that's exciting. That's good news. And that is what is I think exuberant about Sartre and what Sartre is relaying in this essay, Existentialism. You know, there are issues that arise. For example, how is the term of this is probably the most important issue. How is a term of human solidarity really established? Because it sounds great to wax about intersubjectivity and all the rest of it, but how do you know that this isn't just a fiction? Well, guess what? You don't. You don't know. And at least I don't think that. Maybe I'm wrong there. Sartre is relatively honest, but I don't think I think there are points where he hedges his bets a little bit. But anyway, that's what I was taking away from those are the main points that I've been taking away from this essay, and I'm hoping that you are sufficiently engaged that you're gonna perhaps go out and read the essay yourself or other stuff by him. Jean Paul. This is actually just this nice little collection here. Just to wrap it up, just talk about the book more generally. I was just talking about the opening essay, Existentialism. But he has several others. There's Freedom and Responsibility, The Desire to be God, Existentialist Psychoanalysis, which I thought was very interesting. And he's got lots of other stuff too. So, Jean Paul Sartre, a thinker with whom to be reckoned, and he was courteous enough to take the time to define the term existentialism so that we can say meaningfully in our conversations what it is to assume an existentialist position. So that'll about wrap it up for this week, folks. And I believe the next video we're going to do is going to be on this great little book, Biology as Ideology, by Richard Lewontin. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. Who is a scientist and a colleague of Stephen Jay Gould, both rather famous geneticists. So that's forthcoming. I hope you've enjoyed this week. Existentialism, an essay by Jean Paul Sartre. And thanks, by the way, to Jim, who's behind the camera, doing all the fancy pants stuff that you don't really notice until you try to notice it. All right, guys, have a lovely week.